Hello, and thank you for joining me for a brief webinar on on ClientPoint. This is a webinar that is being offered for Franciscan, the users of Franciscan Outreach. And I'm Amanda Fox. I'm here with you from All Chicago. I work with your system administrator for the HMIS, and we are the HMIS lead. Keep in mind that we are available to answer questions for you. If you need to reach us, you can email us at hmis@allchicago.org. You also have agency technical administrators identified internally, and your ATAs are Jonathan and Robert. So notice that we're right in ClientPoint already, and I'm looking at a client by the name of Charles Test. I can also see that this client has an ID number. This client's ID is listed always at the top of the screen here, and you can search for clients using that ID number. Also notice that I'm in this client summary tab right now. What we're going to do is look at what data is in this client's record for a few minutes, and then I'll show you how to create some information yourself. So from summary, I can see some of the client's identifying information, as well as their households, entry, exits, release of information, and some other information might be available for you as well. If I'm following the workflow, I would want to use the tabs available here to enter data instead of going through the client summary screen. I'm going to go through those tabs to show you how they work, and I'm going to start with client profile. Notice that I have the information at the top of the screen here related to client record, as well as I have on the second half of the screen the client demographics information. I'd like to point out that you should know that you can come to client profile if you need to correct spellings of names, or if you need to correct social security numbers, or answer any of these questions that might not have been answered when the client's record was created. To answer those questions or make any adjustments, you would use this pencil, but I'm also going to note that you'll never use this client demographics area. I'm suggesting that you'll never use this because this information actually gets populated from the client's entry assessment. You do not come to client profile to enter client demographics. That would be something you would want to avoid because this information will not pull into your reports. So that would imply that if this information were missing and you entered it on this tab, you would still have to re-enter it into the client's entry assessment. If I do need to change the spelling of a name or a social security number or answer any questions, I would do so from here. Perhaps the social was entered incorrectly and I can change that. As I come to the second half of my screen, notice that there's a client note area as well as an incidents area. Client notes are a good communication tool that you can use internally at your agency, and they are something that will pop open if you put in a client note, meaning it will pop open the next time you go to that client's record. And I'll show you an example of that now. If I click on Add New Client Note, and I'll leave the date as it is, I'll just say this is a test note, but this might be something that you would consider, again, a communication tool. If I say Save, and now if I go back to ClientPoint and come back to this client's record again, and just click on ClientPoint, and I'll click on this client's name from my search results, notice that an unread client note notification window pops open. This is going to be helpful if you want other users that touch this client's record to see a note about that client. As long as this yellow sun is always here, that means that this record is unread. Once this note is read and I click on that and it goes away, if I click on Exit and go back to ClientPoint and click on that client's name again, that note no longer appears. But if I come to Client Profile, and if I scroll all the way back down again, I could click on this icon again to mark it as unread if I wanted other users to be able to see it. So just note that this information will always be tracked here, but whether this is yellow or not means it will either open when you go to the client's record or it will not, but you can mark it as unread again. You also have client incidents, and this is something that would be more specific to issues that arise at your facility that you need to indicate as a reason that the client might or might not be allowed back to your facility. So if I click on Add New Incident, I would want to make sure that I have the correct provider selected. Perhaps this client had an incident at my emergency shelter, and perhaps this incident occurred today. The incident I could describe as something like perhaps the client had some violent behavior issues that arose, so I could indicate violent behavior. I don't need to use the incident code, but I could choose to either ban or not ban the client from the program. Only certain users are going to have access to this screen, and so if you are a user that believes you need to enter this information, I would talk to your agency technical administrator, Robert or Jonathan, and we can make sure we have your permissions increased. Once I say save, I would have a record of this client having a ban perhaps at my agency. I have indicated that there is no ban, so that is something that you can either choose to have as a yes or a no. You can put in notes if you needed to on the incident as well. But notice that this is not specific to those violent behavior issues. The client notes area is more of a communication tool. The incidents is actually something that communicates that there was something that occurred that needed to be documented, that was considered an issue that might or might not ban that client from being able to enter your facility again. So this is what you would use the client profile for. You can edit information here. You would never edit information here, but you can view it, and you would be able to enter notes or incidents. Depending on your user level, you'd be able to enter incidents. You'd always be able to see them if you don't have permission to add them or edit them, but the notes everyone will have access to and will be able to see. As I scroll up, I'm going to come to the Households tab, and this is following our workflow. We go from right to left in our client's records to enter their data. I can see that I have a single male, and there's my single male, and his age, his status as being the head of household, and he himself is the head of this household. If there were no household here, I could click on Start New Household to create a new client and their household. Once I click on ROI, I can see that this client has 2 ROI records, and if I want to see what's in the documentation was for those ROIs, I can click on the pencil. The documentation field is what's going to tell me whether this client signed our traditional HMIS consent form, which is this one, or the coordinated assessment consent form, which is the second record that we'll look at. So this is reflective of a conversation that would happen with the client outside of the database, and it would be a conversation that would need to happen before the client's data is put into HMIS. This is the consent form that's called the HMIS Client Consent Form for Data Sharing, and it is available on the help desk. This implies, by saying yes to this, that the client has agreed to share their primary identifying information. Primary identifying information includes name, date of birth, social security number, veteran status, and gender. I did put this for 3 years in the future of the date that the client signed it. This would reflect the date that the client signed the form. This individual is the witness who also was present when the client signed that form. And now I'll click Save Release of Information. If I want to look at the second record, I'll notice that this is the coordinated assessment entry, which is what we're asking anyone who's serving homeless clients to ask clients to complete. This one is only valid for 1 year, and this is the assessment that you would want to have the client, the consent form that you would want to have the client sign as soon after they enter your program or start staying at your facility as possible, so we know whether they need to be connected to a housing provider in the future. And now I'll click Exit so you can see, again, the screen where there's just the 2 different records. One of them is for 3 years, one of them is for 1 year. I'll also show you an example of what you do if the client has said no to sharing their data. These binder clips are a way that you can attach the actual scanned copy of the consent form that would have the client's signature and the level of permission identified, and you would click on this button to search for the file that you would have scanned and saved on your computer. Now I'm going to go to the Entry/Exit tab, and I can see that this client has an enrollment in my emergency shelter program. And notice that I have an entry date with a pencil and an exit date with a pencil. This suggests that this client only stayed at my facility for 1 day. Typically, your exit date would be in the future at some point when the client stops staying at your shelter. So the entry would indicate when the client starts staying at your shelter. The exit would indicate when the client is no longer staying at your shelter. If I want to look at the assessment attached to this entry, I would click on the pencil in front of the entry date and click on Save and Continue to look at the actual assessment. As I scroll down, I can see that I'm in the HUD, COC, and ESG entry assessment. And as I keep scrolling, I can see the information that was answered when I entered this client in the program. So this client is indicated as the head of the household. I have a date of birth. This is where that demographic information populates from. I would have indicated whether this client was dealing with domestic violence. If I said no to this question, I would not have to answer the 2 subsequent questions. Notice that I also don't have an answer for secondary race, and that's because the client did not indicate a secondary race, which means I don't have to complete that field. As I keep scrolling down, I have indicated that this is not a veteran, so I will not answer these 2 questions, but I did answer the questions around whether the client was homeless, and I indicated where they slept the night before they came to my program. In this case, I've indicated that the client was residing in a place not meant for habitation. That would include clients that sleep outdoors or that are on the streets, clients that are sleeping in abandoned buildings or riding the trains, anything that is identified as a place where an individual is not meant to be habitating. Perhaps your client is coming from an emergency shelter, perhaps jail. Maybe they were staying with family or friends. There's a variety of options that are meant to meet the possibilities for where your clients could be coming to you from. But again, this question is meant to relate to where the client slept the night before they came to your program. I would also indicate the length of time the client was staying in that situation. As I come down, the chronic homelessness questions are next, and I've answered these questions to indicate that this client is actually not chronically homeless. And the idea is that you are trying to identify both where the client has been staying and for how long. And the way that chronic homelessness works is that first, your client must be disabled to be considered chronically homeless, but notice that that question is not asked here. So at this point, you're only looking at the client's housing history. And if the client is coming from a homeless situation, you would say yes to this question. But the way that someone is identified as chronically homeless is if they were continuously homeless for 1 year, for 12 months, and had a disability, they would be chronically homeless. Or if they had a disability and were homeless for 12 months, but that 12 months was broken out over 3 years and occurred in 4 separate instances. That's the 2 scenarios for how the client would be considered chronically homeless. It is important that we answer these questions accurately, so let's show you how this works. Based on the fact that I have said this client entered my program from a place not meant for habitation, I have indicated yes, that this client was coming from a homeless situation. I then indicated how long the client was in that homeless situation by putting a date here of when that started. Since the client had told me that they were in this place not meant for habitation for 1 to 3 months, I went back 3 months to indicate that this client became homeless in March of 2016. The best guidance that HUD has given us on how to ask these questions is to just ask the questions of the client. So truly you would be asking them when this situation that where they were homeless started, and that would be the date you're looking to put here. The 3rd and 4th questions are indicating whether this client was homeless in the past 3 years and how many times and how many months those number of times equaled out to. So if the client were 12 months of homelessness in a time frame that was 4 or more, then they would be considered chronically homeless as well if they were homeless that whole time. But notice that I answered all of these questions, so regardless of whether your client was entering from a homeless situation, I would still need to answer the 3rd and the 4th questions. This can be tricky, so you definitely want to talk to your agency technical administrators if you have questions about chronic homelessness. As I scroll down, notice that I've done my HUD verifications over here, and I've indicated this client has said yes, that they receive income, and I can see that this client is receiving $100 of earned income. I also have $10 or $100 here indicated as the total monthly income for this client. And as I scroll down, we'll go through these in the next client's record of how to enter them. But I also see that this client is under 30% AMI, which was determined because it's a household of 1 receiving $100. So there's the column for 1 household member. They don't hit the first benchmark at 30%, so they're considered under 30% of the AMI. This client was indicated as having non-cash benefits as well. And if I click on this button down here of last, I can see this yes, that this client did start receiving food stamps in April of 2016, and the HUD verification is done because it's a green check mark, so I know that's been completed. This client also had health insurance when the assessment was completed, and if I click in the bottom right corner to say last, I can see that this client is receiving Medicaid as of this date. And now I can see the disabilities. I have indicated that this client is disabled, and if I click on last, I can also see that they have a physical disability. I did not answer street outreach and PATH program questions, nor did I answer rapid rehousing program questions, because those are not programs that Franciscan Outreach is providing. I'll now click Save and Exit to leave the entry. That was just reviewing the entry. The exit, client was also exited, so if I wanted to review the exit assessment, I will click into that pencil as well. We are actually going to go to the steps of creating a brand new client, and to do so, I'm going to go back to ClientPoint. And here, notice that I could plug in this client's ID number if I wanted to go straight to their record, if I happen to have their ID number. But in this case, I'm going to click on Clear to get rid of the information that's already listed here. And I'm going to start with a search for a new client. I'm going to search for a client by the name of Bowman Test. That's going to be my test client. And I'm going to put in just the first few letters of the client's first name and the first few letters of the client's last name. And then I would click on Search to see what possible results I get. In this case, I actually got the result for a client with a similar name, but I'm going to indicate that the client that I'm looking for has a different Social Security number and a different date of birth. So I'm going to come back to the top of the screen and complete filling in their name, answer these questions, and I'm going to walk through the steps of adding a brand new client. So I'm going to complete filling in the first name and complete the last name. Now I'm going to go ahead and answer the name data quality and indicate in this case that it's a full name. I'm going to put in a Social Security number if I have one. If I do not have a social, I can indicate that the client did not know the information or refused to provide it. I can also accept partial Social Security numbers, but in this case I'm going to indicate that I've received a full Social Security number. I'm also going to state that this client is not a veteran. And now I'm going to go ahead and add this client's information. I also want to make sure I add a client and a household at the same time at this point. And once I do that, I will see the household information screens. I am creating a single male household. And now as I scroll down, since I have this client in the selected clients area, I can click on Continue. I have one more screen to complete for the household. And I'm going to say yes, that this client is the head of this household, which indicates that they are themselves the head of the household. And I'm going to backdate the joined household date by one date. I'm going to come to the bottom of my screen here and click Save and Exit. Now I have a household record for this client, and I want to move into the ROI record. If I happen to be coming to a client's record that exists in our system, I would want to add on to existing client records. To add on to existing client records, I would search for the client and click on their name to come to their information here. Once I've done that, I could, if the client didn't have a household, I could click on Start New Household if I needed to. But in this case, we have a household because we just created one, so I'm going to click on ROI. This is the tab where I would indicate the level of permission that this client has granted, and I would have a conversation with the client before I enter their information into HMIS to determine whether they want their primary identifying information shared or not shared. Our clients are all expected to be offered that form. It is available on the HMIS Help Desk, and again, it's called the HMIS Client Consent Form for Data Sharing. We have also added a second consent form for our system, and that's our Coordinated Assessment Consent Form. At Franciscan, we are asking you to use that consent form for your clients that are staying in shelter. And that consent form is meant to help us identify whether that client is willing to have their information shared, additional information beyond their identifying information, shared with our coordinated assessment team. That team is identifying those clients who are chronically homeless to try to match them to housing options. So we're going to walk through entering both consent forms as an ROI record here, and I'm going to start by adding a release of information. Notice my client's box is checked off up here, so I want to start by focusing on provider. The provider is listed as my agency's name, and I'm actually going to leave that as it is at this point. The release granted, I'm going to indicate that the client has said yes, they do want to have their information shared. And I'm going to first enter the coordinated assessment release of information. So I'm going to put in that this client's release of information was signed on this date, so I will leave that start date as it is. I will need to put in an end date, and so the end date will be 1 year in the future for the coordinated assessment consent form. Documentation will be a signed client consent form for data sharing, and I will click on Save Release of Information. The second step will be to add a release of information again. This time I'm going to say no. This client did not consent to share their identifying information with other providers that use HMIS. Since I've stated that, I'm going to have the end date be the exact same date as the start date because there is no release granted. I'm going to then say that this client signed the client consent form for data sharing, and I'll mark myself as the witness. And now I'm going to click Save Release of Information. So since I've said no to this particular release, I also need to make sure that this client's record is locked. To lock client records, you use this green open lock in the upper right corner of the screen, and you turn it to a red closed lock. To do so, I click on that green lock, and I click on this circle with the minus sign in it to take away that global option of sharing. Once I click on Exit, that has turned to a red closed lock. If I happen to come to this screen and cannot take away that global option for sharing, perhaps everything says restricted here, then I would contact the help desk and send the help desk this client's ID number and tell them that they do not want their information shared. We would then take care of locking the record for you. I'm going to go ahead and click Exit, and now I have successfully locked this client's record. I'll now come to the Entry/Exit tab. And from here, I need to go ahead and create the enrollment for this client in the program. This would indicate that the client has started staying at our program's facilities. Once I click on Add Entry/Exit, I would at this point want to choose the provider that aligns with the program that's serving the client or where they are residing. In this case, I'm going to choose emergency shelter. I'm then going to choose as the option for type, I'm going to choose HUD, and the entry date would be the date that the client started staying at my program. Once I click on Save and Continue, I'll start to see the assessment questions, and I'm going to walk through answering some of these, but not all of these. I will say that this client was the head of the household and they resided in Chicago. I'll also state the client's date of birth and the date of birth type. Race values would be completed. You would complete ethnicity, gender, domestic violence. I'm going to skip over those for now to show you the sub-assessments. And I did not say this client was a veteran, so I would skip those questions. I would state whether this client was homeless and whether they are currently living in what situation they're living in before they come to my program. This time I'll choose that this client was in an emergency shelter and just came over to my program as well for shelter, but this would indicate that they were in shelter before they came to my program. Length of stay, I would also indicate that. This time I'll say more than a year. And now I want to answer chronic homelessness questions. And I have asked the client whether they were in a homeless situation, and they were before coming to my program. And since they've indicated that they were in a shelter for a year or longer, I'm going to use this date field here to populate today's date. I'm going to move it back 1 year, assuming that this client may have told me that he started staying in shelters in June of 2015. If that was the client's first time in the last 3 years of being homeless, I would say this was one time. And total number of months would be 12. So that client would be considered chronically homeless at this point if they also have a disability. Length of status documented, or length of time homeless status documented, I'll indicate no if I don't have that documentation. I will say that this client does not have income, and therefore I will click on the HUD verification and say no to all the possible options here and do Save and Exit. I now have a HUD verification green check mark, which tells me I've done this correctly, and I'd want to say 0 for whether this client has income or for their total monthly income. This client is under the 30% of AMI without having income, but perhaps they do have food stamps. And if they do have food stamps, I would be expected to click on Add for having said yes here. And I'll go ahead and say that this client does have those food stamps and they are receiving this benefit. I'd want to say yes there. And I'm just going to say that perhaps this client had told me that they started receiving food stamps when they became homeless a year ago. And I can click Save. Now I want to do my HUD verification and indicate that that is the only source of non-cash benefits that this client receives. That is a yes. Everything else is a no, and save and exit. I now have my green check mark, and I can scroll down to indicate whether this client has health insurance. I'll state that yes, this client does have health insurance, and click on my Add button to specify what insurance they have. If I don't know the date that they started receiving insurance, I can use the date before I created the entry, and I'll indicate this client has Medicaid, and they are covered by this insurance. I'm not going to answer the HOPL questions or the end date question, and just click Save. And now I'll do my HUD verification and indicate no for all the rest of the options, because that's the only thing that they're receiving is Medicaid, and save and exit. I then have the last sub-assessment here to do for disabling condition. In this case, I will say yes, that this client does have a disabling condition, and I'll click on Add. I want to indicate what type of disability the client has. In this case, perhaps they have HIV or AIDS. If the client has HIV, I would say yes, that this has been determined. If they told me that this has been diagnosed, I would want to say yes, that this is expected to be of long-term and indefinite duration. Perhaps the client does have that documentation, so I could say yes to this question. If I'm not operating a PATH project, which at Franciscan you are not, I would not answer these questions, so I would just leave these two blank. But I would state whether the client is receiving treatment, as well as the fact that this is expected to be of long term. Perhaps this client knows that they were diagnosed a couple of years ago. If it was June of 2014 that the client recalls having received this diagnosis, I could put that date here and then click Save. I would also want to complete my HUD verification and say that this is the only disability this client is experiencing by saying no to all of the other options, and the yes will remain here, and click Save and Exit. So now I have my HUD verification, and I can continue moving down. At Franciscan, you're also not doing street outreach or PATH, so you wouldn't answer these questions, nor are you operating rapid rehousing, so you wouldn't answer those questions. At this point, you would just click Save and Exit. And so now I see here that I have an entry date. In the future, when this client chooses to leave my program and stop staying at my shelter, I would click on this pencil to come to the exit screen. The exit here would be the date that they leave your program. The reason for leaving, you would focus on the options after 25 cities, all of these variety of possibilities. But I would have to make sure I answered the destination, and you would choose from one of the appropriate options you have here. Perhaps this client left my program because they went to jail. Then I would click Save and Continue to complete the exit assessment. If nothing has changed from the time the client entered my program to when they exited my program around their housing status, benefits, or any of this information, I would come all the way to the bottom of the screen, and I would not answer the outreach project questions or the homeless prevention questions, and I would just click Save and Exit. That's how you start your entry and do your exit. We've already looked through all the information in the different tabs for the client's record. If I come back to the summary screen, I can also see that the rest of this information has been populated now. Keep in mind that this red lock indicates that the client's record is not visible outside of your program. If you can't change a green lock to a red lock, you reach out to the HMIS team and we'll do that for you. That's based on the ROI. Remember, in the Client Profile tab, you have the ability to enter client notes that are visible to your other users in your agency, and if those notes are unread, they will pop open. That's also where your incidents are available as well. And only certain users will have the access to create and edit incidents. Remember as well that the HMIS team is here to support you. If you need us, you can email us at hmis@allchicago.org. And in the best case, you would also reach out to your ATA, either Robert or Jonathan, to get their input on any challenges you're having. Thank you very much for watching this webinar, and I hope that we will talk more in the future.